The afternoon sun streamed through the tall windows of the Pine Creek Community Center, casting long rectangles of light across the polished wooden floor. Dr. James Wilson adjusted his tie and took a deep breath as he watched people filing into the hall. At 53, with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, James had given hundreds of lectures throughout his career, but community talks always made him a little nervous. These weren't university students who had to be there. These were regular folks giving up their Saturday afternoon to hear him speak about African American contributions to the nation's history. "Nervous?" asked Tanya, the event organizer, as she handed him a bottle of water. "Always a little," James admitted with a warm chuckle. "But the good kind of nervous. The kind that keeps you sharp," Tanya smiled. "Well, we've got a full house today. People have been talking about your presentation for weeks." James nodded appreciatively as he surveyed the growing crowd. The community center had arranged about 100 chairs in neat rows, and almost all were filled now. The audience was diverse. Young college students with notebooks ready, elderly couples who had lived through the civil rights era, families with curious teenagers, and people from all walks of life and backgrounds. This was what James loved most about these community events, bringing history to people outside the ivory towers of academia. At precisely 2 p.m., Tanya stepped up to the microphone to introduce him. "Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're honored to have Dr. James Wilson with us, Professor of American History at Riverside University and author of Threads of Liberty, African American Contributions to American Democracy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Wilson." The applause was warm and enthusiastic as James approached the podium. He placed his notes down, adjusted the microphone, and smiled at the audience. "Thank you all for that kind welcome, and thank you, Tanya, for that generous introduction." His voice was deep and measured, with the slight hints of a southern accent that became more pronounced when he was passionate about a topic. "I'm truly delighted to see such a wonderful turnout on this beautiful Saturday afternoon. There must not be much good on TV today." A ripple of laughter moved through the audience, and James felt himself relax. That was his favorite icebreaker, simple but effective. "Today I want to talk about something that often gets overlooked in our history books. We're going to explore the profound and fundamental ways African Americans have shaped this nation from its very beginnings." James clicked a button, and behind him the first slide appeared, a timeline spanning from the 1600s to the present day. For the next 40 minutes, James guided his audience through a journey of American history, highlighting stories of resilience, innovation, and determination. He spoke of Benjamin Banneker, the self-taught astronomer who helped survey Washington, D.C., of Madam C.J. Walker, who built a hair care empire and became one of America's first female millionaires, of the Tuskegee Airmen who fought valiantly in World War II, despite facing discrimination at home. He was careful to use simple language, painting vivid pictures with his words rather than getting bogged down in academic jargon. When he described the Great Migration, he didn't just quote statistics, he told the story of his own grandfather who had traveled north from Georgia with nothing but a cardboard suitcase and a dream for a better life. "My grandfather used to tell me," James said, his voice softening with memory, "that when he first saw Chicago, with its tall buildings reaching up to touch the clouds, he thought he'd arrived in a different world. But," he would always add, "I soon learned that prejudice doesn't stop at state lines." The audience was captivated. An elderly woman in the front row nodded knowingly, while a young man a few seats away scribbled frantically in his notebook. Even the children who had been brought by their parents seemed engaged, their usual fidgeting replaced by attentive stillness. James continued through his presentation, moving from the Harlem Renaissance to the Civil Rights Movement, sharing not just the stories of famous leaders but also of ordinary people who had shown extraordinary courage. "History isn't just made by those whose names we remember," he explained, gesturing to a photograph of a crowded march on Washington. "It's made by every person who stands up for what's right even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult." As he approached the end of his prepared talk, James clicked to his final slide, a simple question displayed in bold letters. "Where do we go from here?" "I don't have all the answers," he admitted, looking out at the sea of faces before him. "But I believe that understanding our shared history, all of it, not just the comfortable parts, is essential if we want to build a better future together." Because despite what some might have you believe, no single group built America. We all did, thread by thread, creating this complex tapestry we call the United States. James took a sip of water and smiled. Now, I've been talking for quite a while, and I'm sure many of you have questions or thoughts you'd like to share. That's my favorite part of these events, hearing from you. So who would like to go first? Several hands shot up immediately. James pointed to a teenage boy near the back who was wearing a university sweatshirt. Sir, I was wondering how you think schools should teach this kind of history. We barely covered any of this in my high school classes. James nodded thoughtfully. That's an excellent question. I believe we need to. He was in the middle of his answer when a commotion near the middle of the room caught his attention. A woman with shoulder-length blonde hair was standing up, even though James hadn't called on her. Her face was flushed, and she was whispering loudly to the man beside her, who seemed to be trying to get her to sit down. James paused mid-sentence. Ma'am, did you have a question as well? I'm happy to take it after I finish addressing this young man's inquiry. But the woman wasn't interested in waiting her turn. I've heard enough of this, she said, her voice cutting through the quiet room like a knife. She was perhaps in her late 40s, dressed in a floral blouse and khaki pants, looking like she had just come from a day of running errands. You people are always trying to rewrite history, making everything about race. A collective intake of breath swept through the room. The man next to her, possibly her husband, tugged at her sleeve, his face a mask of embarrassment. Patricia, please sit down, he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. But Patricia shook off his hand and took a step into the aisle. No, Richard, I'm tired of staying quiet. I'm tired of being made to feel guilty for being white. She pointed a finger directly at James. My ancestors built this country, not yours. If you don't like it here, why don't you just go back to Africa where you belong? The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Several people gasped audibly. A woman in the front row covered her mouth in shock. The teenage boy who had asked the question stared wide-eyed, his notebook forgotten in his lap. For a moment, complete silence filled the community center. Even the usual creaks of the old building seemed to have gone quiet, as if the structure itself was holding its breath. James stood completely still behind the podium, his hands resting lightly on either side of his notes. His expression remained composed, though something flickered briefly in his eyes. Not anger, but something deeper, more complex. The microphone picked up the sound of his measured breathing as he looked directly at Patricia. Two security guards who had been standing discreetly by the doors began moving toward her, but James raised his hand slightly, signaling them to wait. He took a slow sip of water, his eyes never leaving Patricia's confrontational stare. The tension in the room was palpable. Some audience members began to murmur in disgust at Patricia's comments. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unsure of what would happen next. Richard, Patricia's husband, had sunk lower in his chair, his face a picture of mortification. In this brief, suspended moment, the audience watched James intently, wondering how he would respond to such a blatant display of racism. Would he respond with justified anger? Would he have the woman removed? Or would he simply ignore her and move on? Little did they know that James's response would be something none of them expected, something that would leave the entire room silent once more, but for an entirely different reason. Time seemed to stretch in the community center as all eyes moved between Patricia and Dr. Wilson. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, a mundane sound that felt strangely out of place amid the tension. Outside, through the tall windows, life went on as usual. People walking dogs, a mail carrier delivering packages, children playing in the distance, all unaware of the charged moment unfolding inside. James took another small sip of water, his movements deliberate and unhurried. His mind was racing, though his exterior remained calm. In his 20-plus years of public speaking, he had encountered hecklers and disagreements, but rarely something this blatant, this raw. He thought of all the possible ways he could respond. He could have Patricia removed. The security guards were still waiting for his signal, their posture tense and ready. He could dismiss her comments with an angry retort, which part of him wanted to do. He could ignore her entirely and continue with his presentation as if nothing had happened. But as he looked at Patricia, really looked at her, he saw something beyond the anger in her eyes. There was fear there too, and maybe a touch of confusion. James had seen that look before, many times throughout his life. And in that moment, he made a decision about how to handle this situation. The crowd was growing restless. Someone near the back shouted, "Kick her out!" Another voice called, "Let him speak." Patricia remained standing, her chin raised defiantly, though her hands had started to tremble slightly at her sides. Richard, her husband, was now standing too, whispering urgently in her ear, "Patricia, please, that's enough. Let's just go." But she shrugged him off again, her eyes fixed on James. James adjusted the microphone slightly, the small screech of feedback cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. The room gradually quieted again, all attention returning to the podium. "First," James began, his voice measured and clear, "I want to thank everyone for your patience." He looked around the room, making brief eye contact with audience members, acknowledging the discomfort many were feeling. These are difficult conversations, and difficult conversations sometimes bring strong emotions to the surface. He turned his gaze directly to Patricia. "Ma'am, I heard what you said, and I'd like to respond if I may." Patricia's expression flickered with surprise. Perhaps she had expected to be silenced or escorted out. She gave a curt nod. "My name is Dr. James Wilson," he continued, "though I'm guessing you already knew that from the program." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the audience, releasing a tiny fraction of the tension in the room. "What you might not know is that my family has lived in this country for nearly 300 years. James stepped out from behind the podium, moving to the center of the stage. Without the wooden barrier between him and the audience, he seemed more vulnerable, but also more connected to everyone in the room. "My ancestors didn't choose to come here," he said, his voice growing softer so that people had to lean in slightly to hear him. "They were brought against their will in the holds of ships. But once here, they helped build this nation, physically built it, with their hands and their backs and their sweat." James gestured to the slide still displayed on the screen behind him, showing black and white photographs of African Americans working on railways, in fields, in early factories, and on construction sites. Great-great-grandfather fought for the Union in the Civil War. He was part of the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, one of the first official African American units in the U.S. Armed Forces. James paused, letting that information sink in. He fought for a country that still didn't see him as a full citizen. Patricia's stance had softened almost imperceptibly, but she remained standing in the aisle, her arms now crossed over her chest. "My grandfather served in World War I," James continued. "He came home with medals that he couldn't even wear in public in some parts of this country. And my father served in World War II, fighting fascism abroad while still facing Jim Crow laws at home." James walked slowly to the edge of the stage, closer to where Patricia stood. "So when you suggest that I should go back to Africa, I have to wonder, where exactly should I go back to? My family has been in Virginia longer than many European immigrant families have been in America. This is my home. It's the only home I've ever known." The room was utterly silent now. Even those who had been whispering had fallen quiet. At the back of the hall, a late-coming family tried to slip in unnoticed, only to freeze in the doorway, sensing the weight of the moment they had walked into. "I don't know your family's story," James said, addressing Patricia directly but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I don't know when your ancestors came to this country or what struggles they faced. I imagine they worked hard. I imagine they made sacrifices. Most of our families did in one way or another." Patricia's expression was unreadable now, a complex mix of emotions playing across her face. "What I do know," James continued, "is that none of us standing here today chose where or when we were born. We didn't choose our ancestors or their actions. The only thing we can choose is how we treat each other right now, in this moment." James walked back to the podium and picked up his notes, glancing at them briefly before setting them down again. He didn't need them for what he wanted to say next. "I became a historian because I believe that understanding our past, truly understanding it, with all its complexity, helps us make sense of our present. History isn't about assigning blame or claiming credit. It's about recognizing that we are all part of a continuing story." James looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could, including Patricia. "The version of history I was taught in school often left out the contributions of people who looked like me. It wasn't the full story, and when we don't get the full story, it's easy to misunderstand each other. It's easy to fall into us versus them thinking." A few heads nodded in agreement. Even some of those who had been glaring at Patricia now wore thoughtful expressions. "So I don't want to ask you to leave," James said, returning his gaze to Patricia. "In fact, I'd like to invite you to stay, to listen, to be part of this conversation. You clearly have strong feelings about this topic, and while I don't agree with how you express them, I think your voice belongs in this discussion too." Patricia's arms slowly uncrossed. The defiance in her posture was fading, replaced by something less certain. She glanced around at the faces turned toward her, some sympathetic, some angry, many simply waiting to see what would happen next. "Or," James added gently, "if you'd prefer, I'd be happy to continue this conversation privately after the presentation. I have some historical documents with me, census records, military service records, photographs, that tell the story of African American contributions to this nation. I'd be glad to share them with you." The security guards exchanged glances, clearly unsure if they should still intervene. Tanya, the event organizer, stood at the side of the room, her clipboard clutched tightly to her chest, her expression a mixture of concern and admiration as she watched James handle the situation. Richard tugged gently at Patricia's sleeve again, but this time his expression was different, less embarrassed, more considering. "Maybe we should stay," he said quietly, but in the silence of the room, his words carried further than he likely intended. Patricia looked at her husband, then back at James. The anger that had propelled her to her feet seemed to have drained away, leaving her looking smaller somehow, less certain. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. The entire room waited, the collective held breath almost tangible. Would she leave in a huff? Would she shout something else? Would she accept James's invitation to stay? What happened next would determine the course of the afternoon, and perhaps something much more important than just one community presentation. Patricia stood frozen in the aisle, caught in the spotlight of attention. The gentle hum of the air conditioning seemed thunderous in the silence. Her face had lost its angry flush, replaced by a conflicted paleness. She glanced at her husband, Richard, then back at Dr. Wilson, who waited patiently on the stage, his expression open and without judgment. She began, her voice smaller than before. "I think I'll sit down." It wasn't quite an apology, but something in her tone had shifted. She moved back to her seat, Richard making room for her with visible relief. A collective exhale seemed to pass through the room, attention broken though not entirely dissipated. James nodded slightly, acknowledging her decision with quiet respect. "Thank you," he said simply before turning his attention back to the entire audience. "Now where were we?" He smiled. Not a triumphant smile, but a genuine one that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Ah yes, we were discussing how schools might better teach this history." He returned to answering the question from the teenage boy, picking up his train of thought as if there had been no interruption. "As I was saying, I believe we need to integrate these stories throughout our curriculum, not just relegate them to Black History Month or special units. When we compartmentalize history, we miss how interconnected all our stories really are." As James continued his response, the audience gradually relaxed back into the rhythm of the presentation. Some still cast occasional glances toward Patricia, who sat with her eyes fixed on her lap, but most returned their attention to the speaker. James moved through several more questions about specific historical figures, about modern racial tensions, about how to have productive conversations across racial divides. Each answer was thoughtful and nuanced, neither oversimplifying complex issues nor hiding behind academic jargon. "History isn't just about memorizing dates and names," he explained in response to one question. "It's about understanding the context of decisions, recognizing patterns over time, and most importantly, developing empathy for people whose experiences might be different from our own." Throughout this portion of the event, James occasionally glanced toward Patricia. She remained quiet, her head now raised, listening with an expression that had transformed from hostility to something more contemplative. Richard sat beside her, his hand resting lightly on her arm. After about 20 minutes of questions and answers, Tanya stepped forward to indicate they had time for just one more question. A middle-aged woman with glasses and a colorful scarf stood up. "Dr. Wilson, thank you for your presentation today," she began. "My question is personal, if you don't mind. How do you remain so composed when faced with the kind of comment we heard earlier? I don't think I could have responded with such dignity." A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was the question many had been thinking but hadn't voiced directly. Patricia shifted uncomfortably in her seat. James took a moment before answering, his hands resting lightly on the edges of the podium. "That's a fair question," he said finally, "and the honest answer is that it's not always easy." He looked out at the sea of expectant faces. "I've had a lifetime of practice, for better or worse. The first time someone told me to go back to Africa, I was 8 years old on a playground not too far from here." A sad smile flickered across his face at the memory. "I went home crying to my father, who sat me down and gave me advice I've carried ever since." James straightened his shoulders slightly. "He told me that when people lash out like that, it usually says more about their fear and ignorance than it does about me. He said I had two choices. I could let their words define me and make me bitter, or I could use those moments as opportunities to educate, to build bridges where others would put up walls." The room was utterly silent now, everyone hanging on his words. I won't pretend it's always possible to respond calmly. I've had my moments of anger, of frustration. There are days when the weight of these encounters feels too heavy to bear with grace. James's voice grew softer, more personal. But I've found that responding with dignity doesn't mean being passive. It means choosing how I want to use my voice and my energy. James stepped out from behind the podium again, moving closer to the edge of the stage. The civil rights leaders I most admire understood something profound, that lasting change doesn't come from matching hatred with hatred, but from standing firmly in your truth while still recognizing the humanity in those who oppose you. He glanced briefly in Patricia's direction, not to single her out but to include her in his gaze that swept across the room. It's not about being nice in the face of injustice. It's about being strategic, about keeping your eyes on the larger goal, and my goal has always been to build understanding, not to win arguments. Tanya stepped forward to indicate that time was up, but James held up his hand gently. "If I could just add one more thing," he said. Tanya nodded and stepped back. Education, real education, happens in moments of discomfort as much as in moments of harmony. What happened here today was difficult, but it was also real, and I'd rather have real, honest disagreement than polite silence that masks deeper divides. He smiled again, warmth reaching his eyes. "So thank you all for being part of this conversation, in all its messiness and complexity." With that, James gave a small nod of thanks, signaling the end of his remarks. The applause began slowly, then built to a crescendo that filled the community center. People rose to their feet one by one until almost the entire audience was standing. Patricia and Richard remained seated, but Patricia's hands moved together in a tentative, quiet clap. As the applause finally died down, Tanya returned to the microphone to thank James and remind everyone about refreshments in the lobby. People began to gather their things, the room filling with the sounds of chairs scraping and conversations resuming. James stepped down from the stage, immediately surrounded by audience members eager to shake his hand or share their thoughts. An older gentleman clapped him on the shoulder. 2 college students asked if he would sign their copies of his book. A woman with tears in her eyes simply said, "Thank you." Through the crowd, James caught glimpses of Patricia and Richard. They hadn't immediately rushed for the exits as he half expected. Instead, they lingered at the edges of the room. Richard speaking quietly to his wife, who nodded occasionally, her eyes still on James. After about 15 minutes of conversations with audience members, the crowd around James finally thinned. He spotted Patricia and Richard still waiting near the back of the room. Making a decision, he excused himself from the small group he was speaking with and made his way toward the couple. As he approached, Patricia's posture stiffened slightly, but she didn't turn away. Richard looked nervous but determined. "Dr. Wilson," Richard began, extending his hand. "I want to apologize for the disruption earlier." James shook his hand firmly. "No apology necessary. Public forums are meant for expression, even when it's uncomfortable." Patricia looked up, meeting his eyes directly for the first time since her outburst. "I shouldn't have said what I did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was wrong. The admission clearly cost her something, her pride perhaps, or the certainty of her previous worldview. James recognized the courage it took, however small it might seem to others. "Thank you for saying that," he replied simply. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "I meant what I said about those historical documents. I have copies in my car if you're interested." Patricia hesitated, looking to her husband, who gave her an encouraging nod. I think I would like to see them, she said finally. Great, James smiled. And perhaps you could tell me a bit about your family's history too? I'm always interested in learning how different families came to be part of the American story. A tentative smile flickered across Patricia's face, the first James had seen from her. My grandmother used to tell stories about our ancestors coming from Ireland during the potato famine, she offered. The 1840s then, James nodded. That was a difficult time for Irish immigrants in America. There are some fascinating parallels between their experiences and those of other marginalized groups. As they walked together toward the refreshment table, their conversation continued. Halting at first, then flowing more naturally. No one watching would mistake them for friends, there was too much raw history between them for that. But they were talking, really talking. And in that simple act of communication, something small but significant had begun to shift. Tanya, watching from across the room as she stacked extra programs, caught James's eye and gave him a subtle thumbs up. He acknowledged her with a small nod before returning his attention to Patricia, who was asking a question about one of the historical photographs from his presentation. Outside the community center windows, the afternoon sun had begun its descent, casting long shadows across the lawn. People continued to mill about inside, discussing the presentation, the confrontation, and its unexpected resolution. No one was quite the same as they had been when they arrived 2 hours earlier, least of all Patricia and Dr. James Wilson, two Americans with very different perspectives finding, perhaps for the first time, a small patch of common ground on which to stand. 3 weeks had passed since the incident at the Pine Creek Community Center. The story had spread throughout the small city, retold in coffee shops, at dinner tables, and in the comments section of the local online newspaper. Some versions painted Patricia as a villain. Others focused on James's remarkable response. But few knew what had happened after the crowds dispersed. James pulled into the parking lot of Riverside University's history department, the familiar brick building coming into view as he rounded the corner. Fall semester was in full swing now, bringing with it the usual flurry of classes, faculty meetings, and student advising sessions. He gathered his lecture notes and coffee thermos before heading toward his office. "Morning, Dr. Wilson," called out Devin, one of his graduate students who was pinning a notice about an upcoming lecture series to the department bulletin board. "Morning, Devin. How's the dissertation coming along?" James asked, pausing to chat. Slowly but surely, Devin smiled. "Oh, by the way, there's someone waiting outside your office." "Been there about 15 minutes. James checked his watch with a frown. "That's odd. I don't have any appointments scheduled this early." As he approached his office door, he saw a woman sitting on the bench outside, flipping through one of the academic journals from the nearby rack. She looked up as he approached, and James felt a jolt of recognition. "Patricia," he said, unable to hide his surprise. She stood quickly, smoothing her jeans with nervous hands. "Dr. Wilson, I hope it's okay that I came by without calling first. The department secretary said you usually arrive around this time." "It's fine," James assured her, unlocking his office door. "Please come in." Patricia followed him into the modest office lined with bookshelves and framed historical documents. A large window overlooked the university quad where students were hurrying to morning classes, travel mugs in hand, backpacks slung over shoulders. "Have a seat," James offered, gesturing to the chair across from his desk as he settled into his own. "What brings you to campus today?" Patricia placed her purse on the floor beside her and took a deep breath. "I wanted to return these," she said, pulling a folder from her bag and placing it on his desk. It contained the photocopies of historical documents he had given her that day at the community center. Census records showing his family's presence in Virginia, dating back to the 1700s, military service records of his ancestors, old newspaper clippings and photographs. "Did you find them interesting?" James asked, opening the folder and glancing at the contents. "I did." Patricia nodded. "Actually, I've been doing some research of my own since then." James raised his eyebrows, inviting her to continue. "You mentioned the Irish potato famine, and how my ancestors faced discrimination when they first came here," Patricia said, pulling another folder from her bag. "So I went to the public library and asked for help finding information about that period." She opened the folder, revealing her own collection of photocopied documents, newspaper articles from the 1840s with headlines about No Irish need apply. Political cartoons depicting Irish immigrants as ape-like creatures, and statistics about the high death rates on the ships that brought them to America. I had no idea, Patricia said quietly. My grandmother never talked about this part. She only told stories about how hard they worked, how they eventually bought land and became respectable. She never mentioned that they weren't considered white at first, that people looked down on them for being Irish Catholic. James nodded. History is often sanitized when it's passed down through families. We tend to remember the triumphs and forget the struggles, especially the uncomfortable parts. Patricia looked up at him, her expression earnest. But that's just it. I think understanding those struggles is important. It changes how you see things. A small smile formed on James's lips. That's the beginning of historical thinking right there. Seeing the past with nuance, understanding context. Patricia returned his smile hesitantly. I've been doing a lot of thinking since that day at the community center. About what I said, why I said it. She looked down at her hands. I lost my job 6 months ago. 30 years at the same company. And suddenly I was redundant. They replaced me with someone younger, someone who would work for less money. James listened quietly, letting her speak. I've been angry, she continued. Scared too. Richard's health hasn't been good. Our retirement savings took a hit in the last market crash, and suddenly I didn't know what my future looked like anymore. She looked back up at him. I started spending a lot of time online, reading news sites, watching videos. There were all these people saying my problems were because of people who weren't like me. Immigrants taking jobs. Diversity programs giving advantages to others. She shook her head slowly. It felt good to have someone to blame. It was easier than facing how complicated everything really is. James nodded, understanding in his eyes. Fear is a powerful motivator, and when we're afraid, simple answers are comforting even when they're wrong. I owe you a real apology, Patricia said firmly. What I said that day, it was cruel and ignorant. And after seeing these documents, after doing my own research, she gestured to the folders on the desk. Well, it was also just plain wrong. Apology accepted, James said simply. Patricia seemed surprised by his easy forgiveness. Just like that? Just like that, James confirmed. Though I appreciate that you took the time to come here in person. That says something about your character. A moment of silence passed between them, not uncomfortable but thoughtful. I have a question, Patricia said finally. It's been bothering me since that day. Go ahead. How did you know my name? Before my outburst, I mean. You called me ma'am at first, but later you referred to me as Patricia. I don't remember introducing myself, James smiled. I wondered if you caught that. We've actually met before, though very briefly. Last year at the town council meeting about the new library funding. You spoke passionately about preserving the children's reading program. I was there supporting the historical archives section. Patricia's eyes widened in recognition. I remember that meeting, but I don't recall seeing you there. I notice more than people realize, James said with a slight shrug. Occupational hazard of being a historian, I suppose. We pay attention to details others might miss. Patricia nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning on her face. You knew who I was that whole time at the community center. I recognized you, yes. And you still treated me with respect even after what I said. James leaned forward slightly. Patricia, do you know why I became a historian? She shook her head. When I was growing up, history books didn't tell the stories of people who looked like me. At least not the full stories. They reduced complex lives to footnotes or stereotypes. I decided early on that I wanted to help change that, to uncover and share the histories that had been overlooked or deliberately obscured. He gestured to the historical documents spread across his desk. But along the way, I discovered something important. Everyone's history matters. Every family story, every cultural journey contributes to the larger American narrative, including yours. Patricia blinked rapidly, her eyes suddenly damp. The past can't be changed, James continued gently. But how we understand it, how we talk about it, that's always evolving. And those conversations can only happen when people are willing to listen to each other. Patricia wiped quickly at her eyes. Well, she said, her voice slightly rough with emotion. I'm listening now. James smiled. That's a good place to start. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. James glanced at his watch. That's probably my 9 o'clock appointment, he said apologetically. Patricia gathered her things quickly. Of course I should let you get back to work. As she stood to leave, James had a sudden thought. Actually, Patricia, I'm giving a talk at the library next month about oral history, about collecting and preserving family stories. It's a workshop, really. People will learn how to interview family members, how to document their own histories. He paused. I think you might find it interesting, especially given your new research interests. Patricia hesitated at the door. I might, she admitted, though I'm not sure everyone would be comfortable with me being there given what happened. History is full of uncomfortable moments, James said with a small smile. But it's also full of second chances. He reached for a notepad on his desk, jotting down the details of the workshop. Here, he said, tearing off the page and handing it to her. Think about it. No pressure. Patricia took the paper, folding it carefully before placing it in her purse. Thank you, Dr. Wilson. James, he corrected gently. I think we're past formalities at this point. James, Patricia repeated, a small smile forming. And I'm Patricia, though you already knew that. As she left his office, passing the student who was waiting outside, James felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The incident at the community center had been painful, but what had grown from it was something unexpected and valuable, a bridge across a divide that had once seemed uncrossable. He turned to greet his waiting student, ready to begin another day of teaching history, not just as a collection of facts and dates, but as the complex, ongoing story of human beings trying, failing, and sometimes succeeding at understanding one another. 6 months had passed since that charged afternoon at the Pine Creek Community Center. Winter had come and gone, and spring was painting the city with cherry blossoms and daffodils. The local news had long since moved on to other stories, but for those directly involved, the effects of that day continued to ripple outward in unexpected ways. The Pine Creek Library's meeting room buzzed with activity as people set up chairs in a circle. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. At the front of the room, James arranged handouts on a small table, guides for conducting oral history interviews, templates for documenting family stories, and lists of resources for genealogical research. Need any help with that, James? James looked up to see Patricia approaching, a container of homemade cookies in her hands. In the months since their conversation in his office, she had not only attended his library workshop but had become one of its most dedicated participants. Thanks, Patricia. Could you put those on the refreshment table? And maybe help Lisa arrange the chairs. We're expecting a bigger group today. Patricia nodded and moved to assist the library's community coordinator, who was struggling with a stack of folding chairs. Over the past several months, James had watched Patricia transform from someone filled with defensive anger to a woman with purpose and growing self-awareness. It hadn't been a straight line. There had been awkward moments, misunderstandings, and occasional tensions, but the overall trajectory had been remarkable. The door opened again, and Richard walked in, accompanied by an elderly woman using a walker. Sorry we're late, Richard called out. Mom was having a good day, so we decided to bring her along. James crossed the room to greet them. You must be Mrs. Henderson, he said, extending his hand to the older woman. Patricia has told me so much about you. Mrs. Henderson, Patricia's mother, looked up at him with bright, alert eyes and a weathered face. And you must be the professor she won't stop talking about, she replied with a directness that immediately explained where Patricia had gotten her forthright manner. James laughed. Guilty as charged. We're very glad you could join us today. Well, when Patty told me you were helping her document our family history, I figured I'd better come make sure she gets the stories right, Mrs. Henderson said, lowering herself carefully into a chair with Richard's assistance. The room gradually filled with people from all walks of life. Retirees interested in preserving their memories for grandchildren, middle-aged adults trying to capture parents' stories before it was too late, young people curious about their roots, and a few local history buffs. What had started 6 months ago as a one-time workshop had evolved into a monthly community gathering, the Pine Creek Oral History Project. Today's session was special. After months of collecting interviews and documents, participants would be sharing the family histories they had compiled. James had been amazed by the dedication many had shown, especially Patricia, who had dived into her research with unexpected passion. I think we're ready to begin, James announced, taking his place in the circle. Thank you all for coming today. As you know, we've spent the last few months learning how to gather and document family histories. Today we'll hear some of what you've discovered. He looked around the circle at the now familiar faces. Who would like to start? An older gentleman named Frank raised his hand. He had been researching his Japanese-American family's experience during World War II internment. My mother never talked about this when she was alive, he explained, opening a binder of documents and photographs. I had to piece it together from National Archives records and distant relatives' memories. As Frank shared his family's painful yet resilient story, James observed the room. People leaned forward listening intently. Some took notes. A few dabbed at their eyes when Frank described his grandparents losing their home and business, only to rebuild their lives after the war. Several others shared their discoveries. A woman who had uncovered her grandmother's secret life as a civil rights activist, a young man who had traced his family's journey from Ukraine at the turn of the century, a retired teacher who had documented her father's experiences as a Tuskegee Airman. Throughout it all, Patricia sat beside her mother, occasionally whispering explanations or context. Mrs. Henderson had grown up in a different era, and some of the stories, particularly those about racial injustice, seemed to trouble her. Yet she listened, her expression thoughtful. "Patricia," James said during a brief break for refreshments, "would you be willing to share some of what you found? I know you've been working hard on your family research." Patricia hesitated, glancing at her mother. "I'm not sure if today is the right time." "It's your call," James assured her. "No pressure." Mrs. Henderson patted her daughter's hand. "Go on, Patty. I want to hear what you've learned." After the break, Patricia took a deep breath and moved to the center of the circle, carrying a scrapbook and a small wooden box. "I'm not as good at public speaking as some of you," she began, "but I want to share something important I discovered about my family." She opened the scrapbook to reveal black and white photographs of stern-faced men and women in old-fashioned clothing. "These are my Irish ancestors who came to America during the potato famine in the 1840s. Like many Irish immigrants, they faced terrible discrimination. Signs saying 'No Irish need apply' were common. Political cartoons depicted the Irish as violent, drunk, and not fully human." Patricia passed around some of the historical documents she had collected. "My grandmother never told me about this part of our history. She only talked about how the family eventually prospered, how they became real Americans." Patricia made air quotes around the phrase, her expression wry. "But here's what I discovered that really shook me." She opened the wooden box and carefully removed a yellowed newspaper clipping. "This is from 1921, when the Ku Klux Klan was active in our city. They weren't just targeting Black Americans, they were also against Catholics, Jews, and immigrants." She held up the clipping for all to see. "This article describes a rally where my great-grandfather, Joseph Henderson, spoke out against the Klan. He was Catholic, Irish, and still had an accent. He risked everything to stand up to them." Patricia's voice grew stronger as she continued. "He said something that stuck with me since I found this. He said, 'Today they come for me and mine, tomorrow they'll come for you and yours. Hatred doesn't stay neatly in its lane.'" She looked directly at James then, her eyes bright with emotion. "I never knew this story. Never knew I had someone in my family who stood up against hate. It made me realize that I have a choice about which family traditions I want to continue." The room was silent when Patricia finished speaking. Her mother reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you for sharing that, Patricia," James said quietly. "That's exactly why this work matters. Not just to document the past, but to help us understand ourselves better in the present." As the session continued, James reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. 6 months ago, an ugly confrontation could have ended in further division. Instead, somehow, it had become the catalyst for something healing and constructive. After the final presentation, as people mingled and chatted, a reporter from the local newspaper approached James. She had been covering the oral history project for a feature article. "Dr. Wilson, can I ask what inspired you to start this project?" she asked, recorder in hand. James considered the question carefully. Across the room, Patricia was showing her family scrapbook to a group of interested participants, her face animated as she explained the significance of various documents. "It grew out of a difficult moment, actually," James replied. "Last fall, at a community presentation I gave, there was a confrontation that could have gone very badly. I remember hearing about that, the reporter said. Wasn't there a woman who made a racist comment? James nodded. There was. But instead of that being the end of the story, it became the beginning of one. He explained how he had invited Patricia to see historical documents, how she had done her own research, how a tentative conversation had grown into a community-wide effort to preserve family histories. That woman is here today, isn't she? The reporter asked, glancing around the room. She is, James confirmed. But I'd prefer not to identify her. People should be allowed to grow without being forever labeled by their worst moments. The reporter nodded thoughtfully. Fair enough. So what would you say is the most important outcome of this project? James watched as Mrs. Henderson, despite her age and limited mobility, stood to examine a display of historical photographs on the wall. Patricia hovered nearby, ready to assist if needed, but giving her mother space to explore on her own. I think, James said slowly, the most important outcome is that people are learning to listen to each other's stories with genuine curiosity and respect. When we understand where someone comes from, really understand it, it becomes harder to reduce them to stereotypes or to dismiss their humanity. And has that happened here? The reporter asked, looking around at the diverse group of people engaged in animated conversations. James smiled. See for yourself. 6 months ago, some of these folks would never have spoken to each other. Now they're swapping family recipes and helping each other decipher old documents. It's not perfect, and we still have uncomfortable moments, but it's real progress. As the afternoon wound down, James found himself standing next to Patricia as they cleaned up the refreshment table. My mother wants to be interviewed properly, Patricia told him. She says she has stories about the civil rights era from a different perspective that might be valuable. I'm not sure what she means by that, but she seems eager to talk. That would be wonderful, James replied. Every perspective adds to our understanding. Patricia wrapped a leftover cookie in a napkin and handed it to him. You know, when I first met you, or rather when I first yelled at you, I never imagined we'd end up here. Life takes unexpected turns, James agreed. Sometimes the most difficult moments lead to the most meaningful growth. I was so angry that day, Patricia said quietly. Not really at you, though I made you the target. I was angry at the world, at feeling left behind and forgotten. And now? James asked. Patricia looked around the room at the community they had somehow improbably built together. Now I'm too busy to be angry all the time, she said with a small smile. And I've learned there are better ways to be heard than shouting. As they finished cleaning up and people began to leave, James reflected that this slow, imperfect, human process of growth and connection was perhaps the most powerful response to hatred he could imagine. Not a viral moment of clever comebacks that left crowds silent, but the quieter, more lasting work of building understanding across divides that once seemed unbridgeable.